Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. So you must not be frightened, dear friend, if a sadness rises in front of you larger than any you have ever seen, if an anxiety, like light and cloud shadows, moves over your hands and over everything you do. You must realize that something is happening to you, that life has not forgotten you, that it holds you in its hand and will not let you fall. My dear friend, my dear poet, I am Rainer Maria Rilke, and I write this letter for you, as I once wrote to a young poet many years ago, sending words into the world with no certainty they would ever be read, yet with the quiet hope that they might find the soul that needed them. And I hope this one will travel just as far, perhaps across decades, perhaps even across centuries, to reach you on a night when the noise of the world has grown too sharp for your ears, when every sound presses against you, and even the soft light of the moon feels too heavy for your eyes. I do not write to change you, I would not dare, but to stand beside you in the place where you are, as a friend who knows the same ache. To remind you, as I reminded him, that there is a way to live with this exquisite weight we call hypersensitivity. You see, I know this terrain well. I have wandered in it all my life, sometimes willingly, sometimes as a prisoner in a landscape too vast for my own heart. Hypersensitivity, my dear friend, is not a flaw, nor is it a crown. It is a window, one that opens too easily perhaps, but also one that lets in more light than most windows can bear. And tonight, I want to show you the path I have taken, not as a map, for maps are too rigid, but as a trail you might follow in your own way, stopping where you wish, resting where you must. I write as I have always written, in the quiet, in the dim lamplight, with a pen that seems to know my hand better than I know my own thoughts. I write to you as I once wrote to a young poet, telling him not to seek answers too soon, but to love the questions themselves. You who read me now, I think you understand this instinct already. The hypersensitive soul does not hunger for answers as much as it thirsts for connection, for a sign that someone else has stood in the same trembling air. And so I will speak to you as plainly and as honestly as I can, even if my words wander, even if they take long, slow turns like a river in autumn. For I am not here to give you lessons. I am here to give you company. If I were beside you now, and perhaps I am in this strange way letters allow, I would tell you first that you are not alone in feeling everything. I too have woken with the taste of someone else's sorrow in my mouth, as if I had swallowed it in my sleep. I too have heard the faintest sigh of a bird in the distance, and felt it open a door inside me that I could not close for days. The world is loud, my dear poet, not only in sound but in its constant asking us to harden, to hurry, to ignore. And yet you and I, we cannot help but pause. This is why I say, do not despise your slowness. The world may call it hesitation, but I call it care. When you hesitate, you are listening, and what you hear will shape you in ways the hurried will never know. I will tell you, before we go further, that I have not mastered this way of living. Hypersensitivity is not a problem to be solved. It is a tide to be lived with. Sometimes I have drowned in it. Sometimes I have floated, weightless and grateful. And sometimes it has carried me to shores I did not expect, places of friendship, love, and art that could not have existed without this wide, unguarded heart. My dear friend, I will take you back to the beginning, to when my eyes first learned to ache from beauty. But before we return to those early streets, let me give you one truth that may steady you. Your hypersensitivity is not here to punish you. It is here to deepen you. And the depth it gives will be the depth from which you love, from which you create, from which you truly live. I have always believed that art is not born from strength, but from a certain permeability, the ability to let the world pass through you and still find form in what remains. When I was a boy in Prague, I did not know this word, hypersensitive. I only knew that I could not pass a flower without stopping, that the smell of rain on stone could undo me, that a single unkind word could send me into days of silence. At the time, it felt like a kind of illness. Only later did I see it was a form of perception. But I get ahead of myself, and I promise you, my dear poet, I will not rush the telling. Each chapter of this letter will hold a fragment of my life, not because my life is exceptional, but because it is ordinary enough to resemble yours in its hidden corners. You will find me in these pages at different ages. A boy standing under a linden tree, a young man writing love letters he will never send, an older man staring at a pigeon in a square as if it might answer him. And in each of these moments, you will see what it means to live when you are hypersensitive. Not in theory, but in the tangled, trembling reality of it. Already, as I write, I hear the wind in the shutters, and I think of the tree that waited for me in my childhood, the tree that taught me the first and perhaps most important lesson, to be still, even when the world shakes. That lesson will come in the next part of my letter, and I hope you will follow me there. For now, let us agree on this. You are not wrong to feel so much. The world needs people who can feel. It is only a question of learning how to live without being broken by it. That is the journey we will take together, you and I, through these words, through these nights. So keep this letter close. Let it rest on your table or beside your bed. Let it wait for you on days when the light is too sharp and the voice is too loud. And when you are ready, turn the page and come with me to the streets of Prague, where a boy who could not bear the noise began to listen for something quieter, something that would shape the rest of his days. My dear friend, my dear poet, if I am to tell you how to live when you are hypersensitive, I must take you back to the very beginning, to those streets of Prague, where I first learned that beauty could ache. It was a city that did not speak in whispers. No, it roared and shimmered, even on days when the sky seemed to close its eyes. The cobblestones echoed under the heavy wheels of carriages, iron-shod hooves striking sparks in the early morning light. The air was never empty, merchants calling out the weight of their plums, children chasing each other with shrill laughter, church bells that did not merely ring, but fell like waves upon the chest. For a child like me, every note, every color, every movement entered unfiltered, as if my very skin were a door left wide open. There is something I must tell you now, though I did not yet have the words for it then. If your daily life seems poor, do not blame it. Blame yourself. Tell yourself you are not poet enough to call forth its riches. Later, I would understand what this meant, that the world is never poor, only our way of seeing it can be. But at the time, my dear poet, I could only feel, and to feel without measure is both a gift and a weight. Sometimes it took so little to tip the balance. A sudden glare of sunlight off the Vltava would make me squint until my eyes watered. A harsh word, thrown carelessly by an adult in a moment of irritation, could stay with me for days, echoing louder than the clanging trams. And then, the opposite. A hand resting gently on my shoulder, a smile caught across a crowded room, could unravel me just as completely, sending warmth through me that was almost unbearable in its sweetness. Hypersensitivity is like living in a house without walls. Everything comes in, whether it is welcome or not. There were days when I longed to close the door, but my dear friend, the door was me. My refuge was not made of stone or wood, but of living green. In my grandmother's garden stood an old linden tree, older than my fears, older even than my name. Its roots gripped the earth with the firmness of someone who has known storms and outlived them. The trunk was rough beneath my hands, and if I pressed my ear against it, I could almost believe I heard a slow heartbeat deep within. In June, the air under its branches grew thick with the perfume of blossoms, not the cloying sweetness of a market stall, but a gentle fragrance that seemed to breathe in and out with me. Whenever the noise of the world became too much, I would go to the linden and stand in its shadow. Sometimes I sat cross-legged on the earth, tracing the ridges of the bark with my fingers as if learning a language only the tree could speak. Other times I would lean my back against it, close my eyes, and let the filtered light wash over my face. I came to believe, and perhaps still believe, that the linden knew me. It kept my secrets without judgment, storing them in the same silent patience it gave to rain, snow, and sun. It was there that I began to notice small things, the arc of a petal falling, the way a shaft of light slid between two leaves before fading, the delicate movements of a pigeon's head as it watched me from a branch above. At the time, I did not think of these as poems, nor even as thoughts. They were simply moments, seeds I carried without knowing they would one day grow. The tree gave me a way of seeing that was different from the hurried eyes of adults, who seemed to look only for what was useful or urgent. My eyes, even then, sought what was hidden, what would disappear if you looked too quickly. Yet childhood was not all refuge. The streets beyond the garden gate could be merciless. At school I was quiet, too quiet for boys of my age. Teachers mistook my silence for ignorance, and other children mistook it for pride. The truth is, my dear poet, I was often somewhere else entirely, watching the dust dance in a sunbeam while the lesson went on, or listening to the slow creak of a window frame, or thinking of the linden's branches swaying. I learned early that the world did not value such attentions. In the schoolyard, my eyes were drawn to the shadows cast by the chestnut trees, but the other boys were drawn to the game, the chase, the shouts. I became an observer, a recorder of scenes I could not fully enter. That is when poetry began to form in me, though I had not yet written a word. I felt it as a kind of pressure, an inner swelling that could only be eased by shaping what I saw into something that might last. The tree taught me how to begin, to be still, to let things come without grasping, to receive without rushing to use. I think this is why the memory of the linden is so bound to the memory of my own becoming. Without its shade, I might have been swept away entirely by the noise and glare of Prague. One evening, after a day in which every sound seemed to scrape my skin, I sat beneath the linden and watched the light drain slowly from the garden. The shadows lengthened, The air cooled, and in that transition I felt something wordless take root inside me. It was not relief exactly, but recognition, the sense that the world could be vast and gentle at the same time, if only I stood in the right place to see it. That night, lying in bed, I tried to remember the exact smell of the blossoms, the exact way the sky had deepened to blue. I could not keep them whole in my mind, but I could keep the feeling they left. That, I realized later, is the poet's work. Not to hold the moment itself, but to carry its pulse. So much of hypersensitivity is this, the inability to forget what most people never notice. I remembered not just events, but the color of the air when they happened, the tilt of a voice, the tiny hesitation before a hand let go of mine. These details, unnoticed by others, gathered in me like rain in a barrel. They could drown me if I did not learn to use them. But the linden gave me a way to let the water settle, to see my reflection in it without falling in. Looking back now, my dear friend, I see that my childhood was an apprenticeship, not in school, not in any formal sense, but in the quiet, stubborn art of seeing. The city gave me too much, the world gave me too much, and the linden taught me how to bear it. And though I would leave Prague, and though the tree would stand without me for many years, I carried it like a talisman pressed to my heart. Even now, when the noise of life swells like a tide, I close my eyes and feel its shade, hear the slow heartbeat in the trunk, smell the blossoms of June. From those roots grew the first words I dared to trust with my soul. But once I stepped into the classrooms of my youth, I discovered something far harder than learning, the loneliness of seeing differently, and that would change everything. My dear poet, there is a truth one learns not from books, but from the slow ache of growing up. The crowd does not always make you feel less alone. Sometimes it makes the solitude ring louder, like a bell struck inside your chest. It was in those years, pressed between the gray stone walls of school in Prague, that I first learned the art of watching without being seen. I was never the boy who leapt to answer questions in class, nor the one whose laughter filled the yard. I was the one at the far end of the bench, studying the curve of a teacher's hand as she wrote on the blackboard, the dust rising from the chalk like a pale breath. I found more to wonder at in the shadow of a tree against the courtyard wall than in any of the lessons recited. There is a line I wrote many years later, born out of these quiet hours. The only journey is the one within. I would not have understood it then, but I was already taking that journey, unwillingly at first, then with a kind of strange devotion. When the world outside felt too loud, I retreated into the cathedral of my own thoughts. My classmates did not understand me, nor did I expect them to. Children can be kind in their own wild ways, but they can also be merciless without intending harm. My sensitivity, though I did not yet know it by that name, marked me as different, a strange boy, a quiet one. Silence became my shield, though it was a shield lined with longing. Sometimes during recess, I would stand by the window rather than run outside. Watching them, the games, the shouts, the collisions, I felt as though I were looking at a world I could not enter. And yet, my dear friend, I never turned away. I learned something precious in those moments. How to see deeply, how to notice what escapes those who rush past life as though it were an errand. The way a boy's smile faltered when he thought no one was watching. The way a girl's ribbon slipped loose, unnoticed, until a friend tied it again with care. I confess, here is one of my human failings, that I often invented stories for them, quiet dramas that unfolded only in my mind. It was my way of loving them, these companions who never knew they were mine. School taught me many things, but mostly how to avoid being chosen for sports. Ah, the dread of it. The moment when captains pointed and names were called. I became skilled at standing just so, making their eyes slide past me. Once, a teacher insisted I join a game, and within minutes, the ball had struck me square in the head. "Rainer," she sighed, "you're better with books." And so, I was sent to the library, a punishment in their eyes. But for me, it was a reprieve, a kingdom. The library smelled of dust and ink and something else, perhaps the slow breathing of time itself. There I began to understand that loneliness could be a form of apprenticeship. Each book a teacher, each page a mirror. I read poetry that seemed written in a language I half knew, one my soul remembered even if my tongue did not. My dear poet, if I may offer you something from those years, it is this: do not rush to fill the empty spaces in your life. They are not empty at all. They are like the white between the lines of a poem. Without them, the words would drown. It was then I began keeping a small notebook, not for lessons, but for what I saw. A girl's laughter in the rain, the bent spine of an old man on the bridge, the way winter sunlight seemed to hold its breath before touching the cobblestones. These fragments became my companions. I sometimes imagine that hypersensitive souls are born with a second pulse, one for the body and one for the heart. The first keeps us alive. The second makes us notice. And school, for all its harsh light and noise, was where my second pulse began to beat louder. There were teachers who saw me, though they never said so aloud. One of them, an older man with ink permanently smudged on his fingers, once caught me scribbling instead of taking notes. He took the notebook from my desk, read a page, and after a pause, simply said, "Keep going." My dear friend, do you know how such a moment can plant an entire forest in a child's mind? That sentence became a secret shelter I could return to whenever the world was too much. Despite these mercies, school remained a place of quiet exile. My friends were the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun, the whisper of pages turning, the silent language of glances exchanged and quickly broken. I learned to dwell in that space, half inside the world, half outside it, and to find beauty there. It is strange, but I think my hypersensitivity was sharpened by the very loneliness I once resented, as if solitude were a whetstone and my heart the blade. Without those years of quiet watching, I would not have become a poet. I would not have learned that the smallest details are often the ones that remain when everything else fades. So when I tell you, the only journey is the one within, I do not speak as a philosopher on a mountaintop. I speak as the boy in the corner of the classroom, watching dust motes dance in a sunbeam, feeling that they were somehow speaking to him. From those benches and corridors, I began to understand that my life would never be measured by what I was invited into, but by what I could witness, cherish, and preserve in words. And one day, as if answering a call I had not known I'd made, the first letter arrived, the beginning of a conversation that would shape my very soul. My dear poet, There comes a moment, quiet, almost invisible to others, when the threads of your inner life knot together into something you can hold. For me, it was a blank page, a pen, and the certainty that the words I placed there would outlive the day. Go into yourself. Search for the reason that bids you write. I once wrote in a letter to a young poet, but I might as well have been writing to the boy I was then. The boy who had sat for years beneath a certain old lime tree, letting its leaves fall like little green thoughts into his lap. That tree knew me better than most people did. I spoke to it, not aloud perhaps, but in the way you speak when your whole being leans toward another life. At first, my writing was nothing more than fragments, crooked lines about a beam of light, or the sound of rain tapping the roof like fingers on a door. I wrote them in small notebooks that I never showed to anyone. They were not for the world. They were for the air between my heart and my hand. Letters, too, I began to write. Letters to people I would never send. Letters to the future. Letters to someone I thought might exist somewhere. Someone who could receive the whole of me without wincing. I think hypersensitive souls discover early that life comes at them too fast, too loud, too bright. Writing became my sieve. Through it, I could let the excess of sensation pass slowly, drop by drop, until only the purest meaning remained. My dear friend, it is not that the world became less intense, it never did, but that the page gave me a place to set it down, to make it still enough to look at without trembling. It was during these years that the first great rush of poetry came to me, a rush I could not explain or resist. That rush would become the Book of Hours, my first true offering to the world. I wrote it as if in prayer, though I did not yet understand to whom I was speaking. Each poem felt like a small window opening in my chest, letting the light in, or perhaps letting something out. In those pages, I spoke of God, though not the God I had been taught. My God was the silence between heartbeats, the shadow that follows you faithfully, even when you cannot bear to look back. Writing was not an act of telling, it was an act of listening. The words were not mine until I had heard them in the quiet. And perhaps that is why, my dear poet, I tell you now, do not fear the long pauses. Do not fear the days when nothing comes. Often the deepest writing grows in the unseen hours, like seeds underground. You must not be impatient. You must not dig up the earth to see if the roots are forming. When I look back, I see that my first poems were clumsy, shy creatures, but I loved them as one loves a child who has not yet learned to speak. Each attempt, each awkward line, brought me closer to my own voice, a voice shaped by solitude, by longing, by the endless act of noticing. Sometimes I imagine that old lime tree still standing in its place, holding all the words I whispered to it in my youth. Perhaps it keeps them in its rings, so that if one day someone were to cut it open, they would find my life etched there in circles of light and dark. And once the heart speaks, my dear poet, it will seek another heart to hear it. That is the dangerous and beautiful thing about writing. It begins in solitude, but it longs to travel. It longs to be received. And in that longing, a door quietly opens. My dear friend, there are encounters in life that do not knock before entering. They do not politely wait for an invitation. They simply arrive, like a sudden storm, or like spring in a land that thought winter eternal. That is how Lou came into my life. I did not know it then, but she would become both my compass and my labyrinth. We met in the trembling air of a German summer. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and late roses. The curtains breathed in and out like the lungs of the house. I noticed her before I understood why. There was nothing loud about her presence, and yet the very air seemed rearranged around her. Her gaze, it did not look at you. It entered you, quietly, as though it had been living there all along. It is here, my dear poet, that I must confess something. In her presence, I felt both more alive and more defenseless than ever before. My hands, which could write for hours without shaking, trembled as I reached for my teacup. My words, so precise in letters, came out fractured, like a mirror dropped on marble. And in that unsteadiness, I recognized the truth. Love is not a gentle meadow. It is, as I would one day write, perhaps the most difficult of all our tasks, the work for which all other work is but preparation. You see, Lou was not merely a woman. She was an idea wearing human form. She believed in freedom the way most people believe in gravity, utterly, without compromise. And for a soul like mine, hypersensitive and forever searching for safe harbors, that freedom was both dazzling and dangerous. We spoke of poetry and philosophy, of God and solitude, until the tea cooled and the daylight thinned. She asked questions the way a sculptor touches marble, probing, attentive, seeking the hidden figure beneath the stone. And in answering her, I felt pieces of myself emerging I had not known were there. That is the power of certain loves. They excavate you. My dear friend, if you are hypersensitive, you will understand this hunger, to be seen fully, without having to explain the colors of your soul. With Lou, I did not have to translate myself. She understood without footnotes. But here is the danger. When someone sees you so completely, you risk vanishing into their vision. You forget to keep parts of yourself that are yours alone. In our modern age, perhaps this happens through the glowing screens in our hands, messages sent at midnight, hearts typed in haste, video calls that stretch until dawn. That same fusion, that same intoxication of constant connection, it can be as perilous now as it was in my day. We think the more we are available, the more we are loved. But love, my dear poet, is not proven by constant presence. It is strengthened by the spaces in between. With Lou, the spaces were few. We traveled, read, dreamed together. She opened worlds for me. The Russia of Tolstoy, the landscapes of Nietzsche's thoughts. She treated the mind as a cathedral, and every conversation was a stained glass window lit from within. But the more luminous the glass, the darker the shadows it cast. I began to feel my words bending toward her, my poems echoing her voice. I will not pretend I did not want this. To be shaped by another is the temptation of love. It feels like surrender, but in the sweetest of ways, like handing over the keys to your soul. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the air was still and the books lay closed, I wondered, if she ever left, would I remain standing, or would I collapse like a tent with no wind to hold it up? Perhaps you know this fear. In today's world, we dress it differently. Fear of being left unread, fear of seeing someone else's name under the words we thought were meant only for us. But the ache is the same. It is the ache of dependency, of making someone else the keeper of your joy. My dear friend, I learned, too slowly, that to love truly is to stand as two trees whose roots may touch underground. but whose trunks rise separately toward the light. Lou taught me this, though not in the way either of us might have wished. Our connection burned brightly, perhaps too brightly, and I, being who I am, wanted to hold the flame in my bare hands. You can imagine what happened. I was burned, and yet I could not regret the fire. When I think of her now, I remember not the pain but the expansion, the way she made my heart larger than it had been before. Some loves are not meant to be permanent homes. They are meant to be great, open-air markets of the soul, places where you gather spices, fabrics, strange and beautiful objects you did not know you needed, and then you carry them with you for the rest of your days. If you are listening to this in the quiet of your own room, my dear poet, and if you too have known a love that remade you, I hope you will not curse it for ending. Not all endings are failures. Some are simply the point at which the lesson is learned. I still carry Lou in my lines, in my images, in the way I hold a pen. And though I once feared that losing her would mean losing myself, I have found the opposite to be true. I met more of myself in the space she left behind. So if you love, love bravely, but do not hand over your whole map. Keep one path unshared, a secret garden only you can enter. For when love becomes both sanctuary and storm, you will need a place to anchor your trembling heart until the sky clears again. And when it does, you will see, as I did, that the storm was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to teach you how to dance in the wind. My dear poet, there is a certain kind of love that feels less like holding someone in your arms and more like holding them in your chest, always close, yet impossibly far. I learned this lesson not in a single moment, but in the long, slow unfolding of months when the one I loved was no longer beside me. At first I thought absence was a wound, something to be bandaged, soothed, ignored. But the more I tried to deny it, the more it pulsed. Only when I let myself feel it did I realize that longing was not an enemy. It was a mirror. You see, to be hypersensitive is to live with your skin turned inside out. Every letter, every delayed reply, every silence feels heavier than stone. And yet, I discovered that distance has its own strange alchemy. It can transform the fever of love into a slow, enduring warmth. I began to write, not with the urgency of a messenger racing through the night, but with the steadiness of a gardener planting seeds he might never see bloom. Each letter became a room where I could still meet her, somewhere between ink and paper, between the tremble of my hand and the weight of her name. And perhaps you will laugh, my dear poet, but I found that letters are safer than kisses. They never smudge your collar. They also never get lost in a crowd, never fade with the noise of a busy street. They remain exactly as you wrote them, frozen in the honesty of that moment. But loving from afar is not without its trials. Your imagination becomes a restless animal, pacing the cage. You invent conversations, reread every sentence she sends until the paper feels thin in your hands. And there are days when you wonder, does she think of me at all? Or am I alone in this quiet devotion? This is where I learned one of the most precious truths of my life: to love another without demanding proof. To live in the question, as I once wrote to a young poet. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Even now, I see how this lesson belongs not only to lovers, but to the whole modern world. We live in an age that demands answers, immediate replies, constant updates, the illusion that we are never apart. Yet the heart does not grow in constant light. It needs the night to strengthen its roots. Loving from afar taught me to hold space for mystery, to resist the urge to open every sealed envelope at once. It is a kind of emotional fasting, where what little you taste becomes infinitely richer. For in the end, loving from afar is not merely a trial to endure. It is a landscape to explore. And if you can walk it with patience, with trust, and with the courage to remain wholly yourself, you will find that when the two paths meet again, the love between you will not only have survived, it will have deepened. But my dear poet, nothing could have prepared me for what came next. After the quiet ache of distance, I was thrown into a place where there was no silence at all. A city that swallowed whole every thought, every breath, every heartbeat. Paris, the city of light, of art, of endless noise. If love from afar had taught me patience, Paris was about to teach me how to keep my soul from dissolving in the crowd. There is only one journey, I once wrote, going inside yourself. But when I first arrived in Paris, I thought perhaps I had taken a wrong turn, because everything here seemed to pull me outward, into the streets, into the noise, into the arms of strangers whose laughter I could hear from 3 cafes away. It began the very moment I stepped off the train at Gare de l'Est. The air was thick with coal smoke, perfume, and the faint scent of baking bread drifting from a vendor's cart. I had imagined Paris as a place of quiet inspiration, sunlight on old books, a poet's solitude. Instead, it struck me like a brass band at dawn. Every sound was an invitation and an intrusion. The streets swelled with movement. Horses clattered over the cobblestones, their hooves sparking against stray stones. Newspapers cracked in the hands of boys who shouted headlines I could barely catch before another sound replaced them. A carriage door slamming, the splash of water from a bucket, the low rumble of conversation spilling from a cafe, and the colors. My God, the colors. Shop fronts painted in emerald and crimson, fruit stands overflowing with apricots that looked like small suns, silks in the windows that caught the light and refused to let it go. I would stop, staring like someone seeing for the first time, until someone brushed past me with a muttered pardon, pulling me back into the stream. For someone like me, someone whose mind is a net always half full, Paris was a deluge. Beauty didn't just appear here, it charged at you. One morning, walking along Rue de Seine, a baker pressed a warm baguette into my hands without a word, as if passing a relic. I stood there holding it, feeling the crust crackle under my fingers, breathing in the heat, thinking, this is what poetry tastes like. And then, before I could savor it, a flower seller caught my arm and offered me roses, and behind her, a boy released a pigeon that took off into the sunlight, and in the space of 10 seconds, I had lost 3 possible poems. Paris does not wait for you to catch your breath. It keeps going, faster than your pen, faster than your eyes. The city is a feast, but for the hypersensitive, it can be a kind of famine too. A famine of stillness, of moments long enough to swallow whole. I would go to bed with my heart racing, dizzy not from wine, but from the sheer density of impressions. There were nights when I fled to my small rented room in Montparnasse, shut the shutters tight, and sat in the dark just to hear my own pulse again. And even then, the city crept in, the smell of rain on pavement, the distant music from a cabaret, the echo of voices arguing in the stairwell. If you, my dear poet, have ever lived in a place that overfills you, you know this paradox well. The louder the world gets, the more you retreat into yourself. Crowds sharpen the ache for solitude. Beauty, too constant, begins to blur. And yet, you still ache for it when it's gone. Paris was not without its enchantments. I remember one afternoon in the Luxembourg Gardens, sitting with a notebook I never opened. A little girl was trying to sail a wooden boat in the fountain, but the wind kept pushing it back toward her. She would frown, push it out again, and laugh when it returned as if the boat were teasing her. Watching her, I realized something. I was the boat. Paris kept pushing me out into the current of life, and I kept trying to return to the shore of myself. Sometimes, hypersensitivity in a city like Paris is like standing in a room with 1,000 open doors. Every sound, every face, every scent is another threshold you could cross. But cross too many in a single day, and you forget which room you belong to. And here is the strange thing. In our modern world, even if you have never set foot in Paris, you may know exactly what I mean. The endless notifications on your phone, the scroll of images and voices that never ends, the news that arrives before you have digested the last story. This is our new boulevard. A street that never sleeps, never quiets, never stops offering you another thing to feel. We are all walking through a Paris of the mind now. And for those of us tuned too finely, the question becomes, how do we keep from being played to exhaustion? In my time, I learned to survive it by creating little islands of stillness. A cafe at an hour when no one came. A park bench hidden by a wall of ivy. My own shadow stretched across the wall at sunset. I began to guard my attention as one guards gold. I learned that not every beauty is meant to be taken in at once. Some must be stored away for later, like wine aging in a dark cellar. But Paris also taught me something dangerous. The more overwhelmed I became, the more I longed for escape. Not to another city, but to a place outside the world entirely. A place with no noise, no interruptions, no demands. I began to dream of quiet rooms. Rooms where words could grow in the dark like seedlings, where the only sounds were the scratch of my pen and the slow turning of pages. And so, my dear poet, here is the truth. Paris dazzled me, but it also pushed me toward my deepest need. Not the glittering salons or the roaring boulevards, but the sanctuaries hidden behind closed doors. Because if you feel too much, you must sometimes step away from the music, no matter how beautiful, and close the door, which is exactly what I did next. And in those rooms, away from the world's roar, I discovered something I had never known before, that silence is not the absence of life, but its most faithful listener. My dear poet, you will learn, as I did, that the heart cannot live forever in the marketplaces of the world. The noise, the constant brightness, the collisions of other lives, they are a feast, yes, but even the most delicate soul cannot dine without rest. So I began to seek what I called my quiet rooms. Some were real, small chambers in forgotten streets, where the air smelled of paper and dust, and where the only sound was the crackle of an old lamp. Others existed only inside me, chambers of stillness I could enter even in the middle of a crowded train. The secret was not in the walls, it was in the turning inward, in learning to close the shutters of my senses and listen to a quieter pulse. I believe you understand this instinct, my dear friend. Hypersensitivity is not merely about what overwhelms us. It is also about what nourishes us. For me, these rooms were places where sensations could be filtered, distilled into their purest form, until they became bearable, and sometimes even beautiful. It was in these spaces that my thoughts began to mature like fruit left to ripen in the dark. I learned that silence is not an absence, but a presence that listens back. And in listening, I found words that felt less like mine and more like something entrusted to me by the air itself. The truth is, these rooms were my teachers. They taught me to value slowness, to approach ideas the way one approaches a shy animal, with patience, without forcing. And they taught me that loving without touching is possible, that one can hold a person entirely in the mind and feel just as much tenderness as if their hand were in yours. At times, I think our whole life is a series of rooms we pass through. Some are loud and full of movement. Others are dim and still. We do not always choose which comes next, but we can choose how to inhabit them. In my quiet rooms, I was not hiding from the world. I was preparing to meet it again, with more steadiness and less fear. And then one day, a letter arrived. A stranger's letter. The handwriting was careful, hesitant, as though the pen feared the page. The questions inside it were trembling things. Questions about art, love, and whether it was worth being alive when one feels too much. I read it in silence, then read it again. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside my quiet room. This was not just a letter. It was an open window. One day, I will tell you about the most important quiet room I ever found. It was not in Paris, nor in any city. It was a place where the air itself seemed to listen, and where the walls were made entirely of sky. But more importantly, it was there that I wrote a letter. A letter I hoped might travel across time itself to reach a few rare souls. Souls like yours. My dear poet, you have perhaps heard of it. It would later be called Letters to a Young Poet. And in its pages, I tried to pour every truth the quiet rooms had whispered to me, every fragment of shelter I had gathered against the storms. But those letters have a story of their own, a story that begins not with wisdom, but with the strangest trembling question, and my decision to answer it. Let us open that envelope together. The envelope was small, almost modest, as if afraid of drawing too much attention. Its paper carried the faint scent of damp corridors and candle smoke, like something written in the corner of a dormitory by a student who feared being overheard. The handwriting was tight, deliberate, as though each letter had been coaxed into existence with hesitation. When I opened it, I found no polite formalities, no attempt to impress. Instead, there was a voice, young, uncertain, almost breathless, asking the kind of questions one asks only when alone at night. Questions about art, about love, about whether it is worth carrying such an acute sensitivity in a world that so often mistakes delicacy for weakness. As I read, I felt the walls of my quiet room dissolve. There was only this voice, reaching out across the unknown, asking not for an answer, but for understanding. I recognized something in him. His words trembled the way mine once had, when I still thought sensitivity was a wound rather than a gift. His name was Franz Xaver Kappes, a young man training at a military academy, suffocating in its rigid corridors. And yet inside him lived a poet, restless, questioning, afraid. I could almost see him, sitting at a desk under a dim lamp, holding the pen too tightly, unsure if the page would welcome or reject his confession. I remember thinking, here is a stranger, but also a mirror. And perhaps, my dear poet, that is all correspondence really is. Two mirrors angled toward each other, catching a little more light with each reflection. I did not answer immediately. You must understand, to answer such a letter is not like returning a casual greeting. It is stepping into the room of another soul. And if one is to do that, one must tread gently with bare feet. When I finally began to write, I found myself speaking not as a teacher, but as a fellow traveler. I told him that the only real journey was the one within, that the questions he carried were not burdens to be solved quickly, but seeds to be grown patiently. I told him that art was not a performance for others, but a dialogue with one's own depths. That to write was to strip away the noise until what remained was the quiet truth beating at the center of things. I reminded him, and perhaps I was reminding myself, that the external world is often too crude to measure the worth of a sensitive spirit. That rejection from others is not a verdict, only a sign that one's inner music is pitched in a key they do not yet recognize. Over the months that followed, more letters arrived. Sometimes, his handwriting seemed steadier, his words bolder, as if he had walked a few steps forward on his path. At other times, they sagged with doubt, with the old fear that he was too fragile for the world, too porous to live without injury. I understood him. I had walked through those same questions myself, and I knew they had no quick answer. But I also knew this: the questions themselves were alive, and to kill them too soon in the name of certainty would be to lose the very thing that made him an artist. "Live your questions now," I wrote to him, letting the words carry their own calm weight. "Live them, and perhaps someday, without noticing it, you will live your way into the answers." I could sense, even as I wrote, that he longed for practical advice: what to read, how to write, whether he was good enough. But what use is a checklist to a soul in turmoil? A plant does not grow by being told to grow. It grows when given the right soil, water, and patience. And so I tried to give him soil and water in the form of encouragement, and patience in the form of permission to not know yet. There was one letter in which he wrote of love, and I could feel the ache between his lines. He wanted to know how to love without losing himself, how to give without being consumed. I told him what I believed, that love is not a merging but a meeting, a recognition of two solitudes that choose to stand side by side, touching but never erasing each other. And I warned him, gently, that the hypersensitive often try to love by dissolving into the other, mistaking surrender for devotion. I wish I could tell you, my dear poet, that my words transformed him instantly. They did not. Sometimes he resisted them. Sometimes he wrote back with the same doubts he had sent before. But that is the way of the heart. Wisdom must be heard many times before it finds a home inside us. In truth, these letters were not only for him. With each one, I was also writing to the boy I had once been, the one who hid in the shade of the old linden tree, filling notebooks no one would read. I was writing to the young man in Paris, overwhelmed by the city's noise. I was writing to the countless strangers who would never send me a letter, but who lived with the same rawness, the same ache, I could not have guessed then that these private exchanges would one day be gathered, bound, and passed from hand to hand like a small lamp in the dark. Nor could I have imagined that long after Kappas and I had gone our separate ways, our words would still be walking quietly into the rooms of others, whispering their patient encouragement. But perhaps that is the secret, my friend. The most enduring works are born not from the desire to be remembered, but from the urgency of the moment, the need to speak truth to someone, anyone, who might understand. And so, those letters to a young poet became more than advice. They became a shelter, a place where it was safe to admit that life hurts, that beauty can be unbearable, that art is worth pursuing even when no one is watching. I wonder now if you have your own Kappas somewhere, a friend, a stranger, perhaps even a future version of yourself, waiting for your words to arrive. If so, do not delay too long. The world is often unkind to those who hesitate, but it is strangely generous to those who speak with sincerity. Because here is what I learned. When you answer another's questions with honesty, you are also answering your own. And the strange thing about such letters is that they never truly end. They are still being written, even now, by you and by me, by anyone who has dared to speak gently to the wounded parts of another soul. The envelope I first opened all those years ago is gone now. Its paper yellowed, its ink faded. But the voice it carried is still here, alive in my memory, and in the hearts of all who have ever felt too much and feared it was a flaw. That is the true journey, my dear poet. Not from city to city, but from one heart to another, across whatever distance life has placed between them. And speaking of journeys, mine was about to change again. For letters are only one kind of conversation. There are also those we have with the world itself, with its landscapes, its people, its silences. And when I stepped out of my quiet rooms once more, I found myself walking into a series of places that would shape me just as much as any correspondence. The next map I followed did not lead to an address, but to a horizon. And it would carry me far from the desk, into the shifting light of foreign lands. Let us go there together. My dear poet, there are times when the walls of your room begin to press in on you, when the same cobblestones and shadows no longer reveal anything new. That was when I knew I had to leave, not to escape myself. No journey can do that. But to see if the landscapes of the world could teach me something the pages had not yet whispered. I want you to imagine it. The year is 1899, and I am boarding a train to Russia. The air smells faintly of coal smoke. The station is full of farewells, both loud and silent. I carry a notebook in my coat pocket, already heavy with unwritten thoughts. And as the train begins to move, I feel that strange ache of departure, half fear, half exhilaration. You see, I believed then, as I still do now, that travel is not about replacing one set of walls with another. It is about expanding the room inside your chest until you can breathe more deeply. And so I went to Russia, to Italy, to places where the sky was not the same shade of blue as in Prague. In those early days of travel, I discovered something unsettling. Beauty, my dear friend, is never where you expect it to be. You set out to see a famous cathedral, and instead you are struck motionless by the way a child bends to tie his shoe in the dust. You come for the mountains, and it is the silence between two trees that arrests you. This is the way the world works. It refuses to be curated for your soul. I recall writing to a friend during those travels, and here I must quote myself from Letters to a Young Poet, because these words remain truer than ever. Live your questions now, and perhaps even without knowing it, you will live along some distant day into your answers. That was the heart of it. I did not travel for answers. I traveled to live my questions in new light. In Russia, I learned the weight of winter. Snow there is not the delicate lace that falls for an afternoon in Bohemia. It is a silence that stays, that buries roads and makes the world feel both empty and eternal. I met peasants whose faces were carved by the wind, and I envied them their rootedness. I, with my restless pen, felt like a migrant bird always seeking another branch. Then came Italy, a country drunk on light. In Venice, I felt intoxicated by reflections, the way the city seemed to exist twice, once above the water and once within it. I wrote furiously there, words pouring as if the canals themselves were spilling into my notebook. My book of hours had been seeded long before, but Italy watered it with a new kind of tenderness. Yet, here is the truth. Wherever I went, I carried my hypersensitivity with me. A foreign street could overwhelm me as much as my childhood square in Prague. The market cries, the scent of roasting chestnuts, the shifting play of shadows on old stone. It all pressed in at once, too much, too vivid. There were days when I had to retreat to my rented room and close the shutters, not out of disinterest, but to protect the fragile machinery of perception. Perhaps you know this, my dear friend. You go to a party, intending joy, and instead you leave with your heart rattled, your mind full of echoes that will not fade. Hypersensitivity is not cured by changing scenery. It must be befriended. And so I began to travel differently. I no longer sought the loudest wonders or the grandest vistas. I sought the small, the unassuming. A cup of thick, bitter coffee in a quiet cafe before the city stirred. A stray cat sleeping in a patch of sunlight. A bridge no one wrote about, but which crossed something in me. In these moments, I began to understand that self-discovery is not a lightning strike. It is sediment gathering in a riverbed, day after day, until the water shapes a new course. I remember sitting in Duino, facing the Adriatic. The sea was restless that day, the wind pulling at my coat like a child demanding attention. And out of nowhere, the first lines of what would become the Duino elegies came to me. Those cries to the angels, those desperate questions about beauty and terror. They were born not in a library, but in salt air and windburn. You see, my dear poet, the world speaks, but only if you are willing to listen without agenda. Too often we move through new places like collectors, ticking off sites, but the soul does not keep lists, it keeps impressions. Now, I will confess something. I used to think travel was about finding myself, but the more I wandered, the more I saw that I am made of all the places I have touched, and all the places that have touched me. A fragment of Russian snow lives in my silence. A Venetian reflection glimmers in my joy. And somewhere inside me, the wind of Duino still calls out to the angels. Today, in our restless century, travel is faster, noisier, more photographed. You can stand before a mountain and feel your phone vibrate with a message from someone far away. And yet, I believe the essence of travel has not changed. It is still the art of seeing, of standing still long enough in a foreign place for it to whisper something it would never tell a tourist. If you're hypersensitive, as I am, you must travel like a poet, not a consumer. Choose fewer destinations, but inhabit them more deeply. Walk the same street at dawn, at noon, and at dusk, and notice how it tells you 3 different stories. Sit on a bench and let the city pass through you instead of chasing it. Let a single tree in a foreign square become your friend for a week. All of this taught me that my truest map was not inked on paper. It was drawn by seasons, spring's impatient blossoms, summer's languid heat, autumn's noble decay, winter's stern mercy. I realized then that the landscapes outside were always in dialogue with the landscapes within, and that is where the road began to bend, my dear friend. For as much as I loved the streets of Paris and the canals of Venice, I began to long for something older, something slower, the steady pulse of a forest, the way a single leaf can hold an entire summer in its veins, the patience of a tree that does not hurry to bloom. Yes, the cities had taught me much, but they had also tired me. And so, with my notebooks heavy with questions and my heart craving a quieter teacher, I turned my steps toward the one confidant who had never failed me. And that, my dear poet, is how I found myself walking once more toward the shade of the old linden tree, where nature itself would become my truest companion. My dear friend, my dear poet, there are places in the world that do not speak in words, yet hold entire conversations with those patient enough to listen. For me, that place has always been nature, not as a backdrop, but as a confidant. I think of it as I might think of an old friend who has never betrayed a secret, who has never told me I was too much or too fragile. I remember the Tilleul, my linden tree, as though I had just walked past it this morning. It was not majestic in the way of mountains or oceans. It did not need to be. Its majesty lay in its constancy, in the way its leaves trembled when the wind whispered, in the way its roots sank into the soil as if refusing to be hurried. I would sit there for hours, often with a notebook, sometimes with nothing but my thoughts, and watch the seasons turn like slow pages in a book I would never finish reading. Once, while sitting under its branches in late spring, I felt a thought rise in me, clear and insistent. Everything is gestation and then bringing forth. I would write that later in a letter, but in that moment it was not yet a sentence. It was a truth I could feel in the pulse of the earth beneath me. Life was not a straight road toward achievement. It was waiting, nurturing, letting the invisible ripen until it could emerge. I think hypersensitivity has the same rhythm, my dear poet. You feel so much, so quickly, that you think you must act on it at once. But the heart, like the seasons, has its own timing. Winter does not apologize for being slow, nor spring for arriving suddenly. The linden tree taught me that my feelings were not mistakes to be fixed, but seeds to be tended. There is a temptation, especially when the world feels loud, to imagine that we must hide from it entirely. I know this temptation well. In Paris, the noise became so overwhelming I would retreat to any scrap of green I could find, sometimes a park, sometimes even a single tree in a courtyard. But nature did not demand that I disappear from the world. It simply showed me another way to be in it, rooted and open, still and alive. One autumn, I traveled to a small village in the Austrian countryside. There, the hills rolled like the backs of sleeping animals, and the air was thick with the smell of damp leaves. I walked alone for hours, not in search of anything, but in the quiet companionship of the land. The river moved at its own pace. The clouds drifted without hurry. It struck me that in nature, nothing seems to compare itself. The oak does not envy the willow. The stream does not scold itself for not being the sea. Could we not live the same way? My dear friend, if you are hypersensitive, you are already attuned to these small miracles. You see the blush of the sky just before sunset. You hear the tired sigh in a stranger's voice. You feel the first cool breath of autumn before anyone else has noticed. These are not weaknesses. These are your roots. And like a tree, you are shaped not only by the storms you endure, but by the sunlight you quietly collect. I have often wondered whether my writing is simply an attempt to speak in the same way nature speaks, without demand, without pretense, only with presence. The Book of Hours was born partly from this longing. In those poems, I tried to let the seasons and landscapes carry the weight of my thoughts, because I trusted them more than I trusted rhetoric. Nature has never lied to me. It has never promised permanence, but it has always offered return. There is a danger in hypersensitivity, though. You may believe that because you feel everything so intensely, you must answer every feeling with immediate action. But nature reminds us, not every seed must sprout at once. Some must lie in the dark for a long time, absorbing what they can from the unseen. I think of my years of loneliness, of loves I could not keep, of questions I could not answer. They were winters, yes, but winters in which the roots deepened. Sometimes I would lean my back against the trunk of my linden and imagine it listening. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps, as I have often suspected, we only imagine that nature hears us because in its stillness, we finally hear ourselves. Either way, when I stood to leave, I always felt lighter, as though the tree had agreed to keep what I had told it, safe from the world's interruptions. If I could give you one practice, my dear poet, it would be this. Find your tree. It does not have to be a linden. It does not even have to be a tree. It might be a rock by the shore, a bench under a crooked street lamp, a quiet corner of your own room. Return to it often, in all seasons, and let it keep the measure of your life. Write there, think there, or simply sit. In time, you will notice that it has become a mirror, reflecting back to you not the chaos of the world, but the steadiness of your own soul. And know this, nature is not separate from you. You are not an observer at the edge of its stage. You are part of its script. The breath you take is borrowed from its trees. The water you drink has traveled through its clouds and rivers. The warmth you feel in the sun is the same warmth that ripens fruit and wakes flowers. When you forget your place in the world, go outside and remember that you belong to it. Not by earning your place, but by existing. I have carried this lesson into love, into art, into solitude. I have learned that just as the moon does not pull the tide in all at once, you cannot force the heart to open before it is ready. You must trust its phases, its gentle gravities. And when the time comes, when something in you has ripened enough to be shared, you will bring it forth as naturally as a tree releases its blossoms. My dear friend, my dear poet, the world may tell you to toughen yourself, to grow bark so thick that nothing can wound you. But bark that cannot be pierced also cannot feel the rain. I would rather you remain tender and find your shelter in the seasons, knowing that storms will come, but so will calm. You do not have to harden to survive. You only have to root yourself in what is real and let time do the rest. And perhaps that is the secret, to see yourself as part of something ancient and enduring, something that has been shaping beauty long before you arrived and will go on shaping it long after you are gone. Nature will hold you in that truth, as it has held me. And from here, from these roots, we must step carefully toward another kind of connection, one that is not with the soil or the sky, but with another human soul. For even the strongest tree reaches its branches toward a companion. Shall we walk there together? Because now, my dear poet, it is time to speak of love in its quieter, wiser form. Love changes its costume as we grow older. In youth, it comes dressed in fire, impatient, luminous, eager to consume. But later it arrives more like autumn sunlight, warm but slanting, touching everything with a softer hand. I have lived long enough to know both, and I tell you truthfully, there is a particular beauty in the loves that come after the storms. When I was young, I thought love was meant to overwhelm me. I chased it the way a child chases waves, running forward, laughing, only to be knocked down and pulled under. And I will not deny it, my dear poet. There was joy in that surrender. But there was also a cost. Each time I surfaced, it was harder to breathe. My heart bore the salt and bruises of too many tides. Later in life, love began to change its voice when it spoke to me. It no longer shouted across the street. It leaned in and whispered, as though it had learned my language. This new love did not demand I abandon my solitude. It stepped inside it, quietly, like someone entering a cathedral and knowing instinctively to lower their voice. I began to see companionship, not as a merging of selves, but as two gardens side by side, each tended by its own hands, yet close enough for the scents and colors to mingle. I understood then that to truly see another person is to let them remain themselves. And to be truly seen is to be allowed to keep your own shape, even while standing close enough to feel their shadow on your skin. That, my dear poet, is why I once wrote, and still believe, love consists in this: two solitudes that protect and touch and greet each other. These solitudes are not prisons, they are sanctuaries. In my later years, I came to cherish relationships that did not require constant presence to remain alive. I think often of Baladine Klosowska, whose company was like a lamp quietly lit in the next room. We could pass days apart, yet her presence still warmed my thoughts. There was no need for grand declarations. A single glance, a letter folded in her precise handwriting, could carry more meaning than the wildest embraces of my youth. I learned, too, the deep tenderness of friendships that are almost like love, and loves that are almost like friendship. With some, I shared the pleasure of long walks where little was said. With others, the joy of letters that meandered through philosophy, poetry, and the small details of the day. My dear poet, I tell you, the friendships that endure are often the ones that leave you breathing more easily, not gasping for air. And if I may speak to your own century, where every message demands an instant reply, where your solitude is interrupted by the glowing insistence of a screen, understand this: real companionship does not need to knock every hour. It trusts. It waits. It thrives in the quiet intervals where you return to yourself. The lovers and friends who deserve a place in your life will be the ones who give you space to live it. I remember, during a stay in Museau, watching the light fall differently each day on the same stone wall. It struck me that people too change their light without ever moving away from you. One morning they are golden and expansive, the next they are blue and shadowed, yet they are still the same wall, still part of your landscape. To love someone over years is to witness those changes without trying to paint over them. Perhaps this is why my later love letters were shorter. I no longer felt the need to fill every page. I trusted the white space between my words to carry meaning. It is the same with presence. You do not need to speak every thought aloud to be understood. Sometimes the greatest closeness is felt in silence, in watching someone pour tea, or listening to their breath steady as they fall asleep beside you. And yet, I will confess, there are moments when solitude can ache even in the presence of another. This is the paradox of later love. It teaches you that even the closest hand cannot shield you from the turning of the years. Illness, distance, misunderstanding, they arrive uninvited, and no bond, however deep, is entirely safe from them. In my own life, the fragility of health began to cast a longer shadow. I felt it in the slowing of my steps, in the way my chest tightened on cold mornings. Even the act of writing long letters grew more tiring. Still, I would not trade those final companionships for all the fiery passions of my youth. They were quieter, yes, but also steadier, like the difference between a sudden storm and the patient rhythm of the tide. One crashes and is gone. The other returns again and again, reshaping the shore in ways you barely notice until the years have passed. I think now of a friend, his name is unimportant, who once told me, over a simple meal, that he valued our conversations because they never demanded agreement. We could disagree and still walk home under the same stars, untroubled. This too is love, not the erasing of differences, but their gentle coexistence. So, my dear poet, if you are searching for love, seek also for the kind of solitude that can live beside another's solitude. Find someone whose absence feels like a room kept ready, whose presence does not crowd the furniture of your soul, and do the same for them. In the end, later loves taught me what early loves could not, that the truest intimacy is not in holding tightly, but in standing beside each other without fear of the space between. But no matter how gentle or steadfast love may become, it cannot protect us from the slow approach of time. Even as I cherished these bonds, I felt another companion drawing near, one I had not invited, yet could not refuse. It came not with flowers, but with the quiet weight of fatigue, the long pauses between breaths, the awareness that each season might be my last in this place. And so, hand in hand with those I loved, I began to walk toward that stiller chapter, the one where even love must yield to the body's slowing tide. There comes a time, my dear friend, when the body begins to speak a language we have ignored for too long. At first, it whispers, a little fatigue after the climb, a heaviness in the chest when the wind turns cold. Then, if we pretend not to hear, it speaks louder, and one day it says, "Sit down. You will not move until you listen." When illness came to me, it was not with a single blow, but with a slow tightening, like winter frost claiming the edges of a window pane. I had always been a man who lived through the senses, colors, scents, voices, but now my senses became sharper in a different way. Pain has its own clarity. It trims away what is unnecessary. It asks you to see what remains when all the rushing stops. In those first days, I fought it. I told myself I had too many letters left to write, too many gardens left to see, too many faces waiting for me at train stations. But the truth was quieter, and it waited for me in the silence of the sick room. There, between the ticking of the clock and the slow rhythm of my own breath, I began to hear it. Not a command, but a suggestion, as gentle as falling snow. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. I share these words with you now, not as something to memorize, but as something to breathe. When you are forced to stop, whether by illness, grief, or the exhaustion of simply living, it is tempting to believe life has left you behind. But perhaps this pause is not a punishment. Perhaps it is a turning, a season you did not expect, but one that will shape you nonetheless. I remember lying in bed one afternoon, the curtains half closed. Outside, the branches swayed in a slow rhythm, and for the first time in months, I did not think about what I was missing. I thought instead about the light, how it filtered through the fabric, how it painted the wall in quiet gold. The poet in me returned then, not to chase great lines or grand images, but to notice what was already here. Illness has a way of stripping life down to its essentials. You learn which friends will sit with you without needing to speak. You learn that tea tastes better when someone else has poured it for you. You learn the difference between loneliness and solitude, and you discover that the latter can be as nourishing as a well-tended garden. In those slower days, letters became my way of traveling. I wrote to people I had not seen in years, not with the urgency of youth, but with the patience of someone who knows time is a river that bends, and sometimes it will bring us back to the same shore. I wrote to young poets still certain they must run toward everything at once. I told them that sometimes the truest journey is the one you take lying still, watching how the sunlight moves across the floor. There is a kind of courage in slowing down. We live in an age, yes, even in my time it was true, that worships speed, productivity, and noise. To be still in such a world is to step out of the parade and watch it pass, knowing you will not march with it again in the same way. But when you stop, you notice things the marchers cannot see, the look in a stranger's eyes, the quiet change in the air before rain, the soft courage of your own breath continuing. I will not pretend there was no fear. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if the strength I had known would ever return. But even fear can become a companion if you greet it without trying to chase it away. I began to imagine it as a shy guest, sitting at the far end of the room, not speaking but not leaving either. Over time, we learned to coexist, and something unexpected happened. The less I fought my limits, the more space I found inside them. I could not travel far, but I could walk in the garden and see it change from morning to evening. I could not write for hours without rest, but I could shape a single sentence with the care of a jeweler cutting a gem. I began to value depth over breadth, the quality of one moment over the accumulation of many. To you, my dear friend who feels too much, I say this: slowing down does not mean you are losing life. Sometimes it means you are finally tasting it. The world will try to hurry you, with its demands, its noise, its insistence that your worth is measured by motion. Do not believe it. Your worth lies in the tenderness you bring to each small act. A cup of tea, a letter written by hand, the way you listen when someone speaks. One evening, I sat beneath the old linden tree, wrapped in a shawl. The leaves trembled in the wind, and I thought of all the seasons it had seen. My boyhood tears, my first love, my restless years of travel. And now, it saw me in stillness. The tree did not judge the change. It simply stood, as it always had, patient through storms and sun alike. I began to think perhaps our lives should be like that. Not a constant reaching, but a rootedness that allows us to weather whatever comes. In illness, I learned that to endure is not merely to survive. It is to keep a place inside you where beauty can still arrive, even if it must come quietly. And so, when the strength slowly returned, as it does in ways you cannot predict, I did not rush to reclaim the pace I once kept. I carried the stillness with me, like a hidden room I could enter whenever the world became too loud. If you find yourself in such a season, whether by choice or by force, remember this: it will change you. And that change may be the very thing you need to carry you into the next part of your life. The slowing down is not the end of your story. It is the part where you begin to see more clearly. In that quiet, as I listened to the rhythm of my own breath and the far-off sound of evening bells, the answer began to take shape. Not all at once, not like a revelation from the heavens, but like a seed pushing through soil. It was the same answer I had been circling all my life, the one I had written toward without knowing it. And that, my dear poet, is where we must go next, to the years when wisdom began to gather like soft light at the close of day. For there, in the quiet years, lies the gift illness left behind, a gift I am ready to share with you now. By the time I reached the quiet years of my life, the storms had already passed. Their echoes still lingered in the corners of my mind, but the thunder no longer startled me. I had learned to sit with the rain, even welcome it, knowing it would water something I could not yet see. In youth, I had searched for answers with the desperation of a miner in the dark, swinging my pickaxe at every rock. Now I understood that some treasures are found only when you stop digging and let the earth open by itself. In those years, I lived in Switzerland, my body slower than before, my days shaped by a rhythm I had once resisted, waking early, writing in the pale light, walking alone in the afternoons. The world outside my window had become a canvas of subtle changes. I began to notice things I had always been too hurried to see. The way snow falls in complete silence, as if the air itself is holding its breath. How a single leaf clings stubbornly to a winter branch, trembling but unyielding. These small things became my teachers. I often returned in memory to the young poet I once was, the boy in Prague who cried at the sound of a church bell or the slant of light across a table. He had been ashamed of his tears, certain they made him weak. How I wished I could sit beside him now and say, "Keep them. They will be your most faithful companions." In the quiet years, I finally understood that the task of life was not to harden myself against feeling, but to grow strong enough to carry it. I once wrote to a young poet that the only sadnesses that are dangerous and unhealthy are the ones we carry around in public. And I meant it. Not because sadness should be hidden out of shame, but because the most delicate emotions need the shelter of solitude to transform. A butterfly cannot emerge if we keep touching its wings. In the same way, our griefs must be allowed to unfold in private, where no one tries to hurry them along. This was the wisdom the later years brought, that hypersensitivity is not a flaw to cure, but a craft to refine. Just as a musician learns to tune his instrument so it does not shatter under the force of its own sound, we must learn to tune ourselves. For me, this meant protecting my mornings, refusing the endless chatter of the world until I had first spoken with myself. It meant reading slowly, without rushing to the last page. It meant saying no to company when my heart was not ready to receive it. These were not acts of selfishness. They were the conditions in which I could truly offer myself to others when the time came. I learned to design my days like a poem, every hour a line, every pause a comma, every encounter a word chosen with care. Sometimes that meant leaving spaces unfilled, resisting the modern hunger to be endlessly occupied. I had spent much of my youth fearing those empty spaces, thinking they meant my life was small. Now I saw them for what they were, the white margins that make the text legible. Of course, this quiet was not without its shadows. Illness had begun to visit me more often, reminding me that my body, too, was an impermanent home. At first I met it with resistance, a kind of insulted disbelief. But then I remembered the words I had once offered to others. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. And I realized that even the weakness of the body could be lived with grace if I allowed it to teach me something. Slowness, after all, is not an enemy. It is a different way of inhabiting time. In those years, I became less concerned with producing great works and more devoted to living greatly in small moments. The way steam curls from a cup of tea, the brief flare of gold on the mountains before sunset. A letter from an old friend, written in a hand that grows shakier each year. These were no less sacred than the Duino elegies or the sonnets to Orpheus. In fact, I began to suspect they were the true masterpieces, written not on paper but in the soul. I want you, my dear poet, to understand something. Wisdom is not a fortress you build against the world. It is a garden you tend within it. You do not shut the gate to keep others out. You simply choose who may enter and when. And when the storms come, as they always do, you do not curse the rain. You know it is feeding the roots you cannot see. Sometimes people ask me in those later years how to live with such a thin skin in a world that often feels made of stone. I would smile and tell them, don't try to grow thicker skin. Grow deeper roots. Let your sensitivity draw nourishment from the unseen, from the silence beneath noise, from the pauses between words, and know that you are not here to compete with the hardness of the world. You are here to soften it in ways that may never be visible but are no less real. I am telling you all this because I know how easy it is to believe that the world belongs to the unshakable, the fast, the loud. But the truth is, the most enduring things are rarely loud. The oak does not rush its growth. The river carves valleys without raising its voice. In the quiet years, I learned that you do not need to be louder than life to live it fully. You only need to be present enough to feel it. And so, if you are young and feel overwhelmed by the force of your own sensitivity, hear this from one who has walked that long road. It will not always feel like drowning. One day, it will feel like breathing underwater. The very thing that made life unbearable will become the thing that makes it beautiful. But you must give it time. You must learn its language. You must stop asking it to behave like something else. When I think back now, it is not the applause or the fame that warms me. It is the memory of a single evening, sitting under the old linden tree with a notebook on my lap, writing as the wind moved through the leaves. No audience, no deadline, no purpose other than to be in that moment fully. That is the heart of it, my dear poet. That is where the wisdom of the quiet years begins, not in grand declarations, but in the soft, steady decision to keep showing up for your own life. And so I returned, again and again, to that tree where it all began, to listen, to write, to remember. Because in the end, all the journeys, all the loves, all the questions led me back to the same place. A boy in Prague, learning that the world was both too much and not enough, and a man in Switzerland, finally at peace with that paradox. And from here, from the shelter of its branches, I am ready to tell you the last thing I have learned. My dear poet, if you have followed me until now, then you have walked through the gardens and storms of my life. You have seen the boy in Prague who wept at shadows, the youth who fell into love like a fever, the man who wandered through Paris's noise in search of a quiet room. You have met my first loves, my distant loves, my later loves, and the silences that held them all. You have watched me write letters that outlived their addressees, and poems that were nothing more than the distilled air of my own longing. And through it all, you have seen one thread that never broke, the art of living with a heart that feels too much. That is what you came for. That is what you are still here for. When I tell you that hypersensitivity is not a flaw but a faculty, I am not reciting a kind consolation. I am offering you the truth as I have lived it. For decades, the world told me my sensitivity was an illness to be cured, a weakness to be overcome. But the longer I walked among the seasons, the more I understood. My sensitivity was the instrument through which I played life. Without it, the music would have been silent. So if your own heart bruises too easily, do not rush to harden it. Instead, learn to carry it the way a violinist carries her instrument, not carelessly, not so tightly that it cracks, but with a reverence for the sound it can make. Yes, it will be difficult. People will mistake your quiet for weakness, your pauses for indecision, your tears for surrender. Let them. They do not yet speak the language you do. And here is the first lesson you may carry into your daily life. Keep your inner world vivid. Fill it with what stirs you, paintings, music, the sound of leaves tapping against your window at night. Guard these as you would guard a candle from the wind. They will feed you on days when the outer world feels barren. If your daily life seems poor, do not blame it. Blame yourself. Tell yourself you are not poet enough to call forth its riches. Wonder is an act of attention, not a gift bestowed from elsewhere. The second lesson is patience. I have lived long enough to know that what feels unbearable today will someday become the very texture of your strength. Trust that your wounds are not closing against you, but around you, forming shapes you cannot yet recognize. This is why I once told a young poet, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves. The questions are not interruptions to your life. They are the secret architecture of it. And then there is love, the force that both crowns and tests our sensitivity. You will be tempted to seek in others a place to rest from your own intensity. Resist that temptation. The task, as I learned through joy and wreckage alike, is not to merge into another until you are lost, but to stand as yourself beside them. Two solitudes that protect and touch and greet each other, as I once wrote. The more you can love without needing to consume, the more you will discover that love is not a storm to survive, but a climate in which you can grow. In your own life, this means choosing relationships where you can keep your own room, your own books, your own silence. It means not fearing the evenings you spend alone, for they are the soil in which your roots deepen. It means recognizing that intimacy is not built only in moments of closeness, but also in the graceful distance that allows each soul to breathe. Do not believe those who tell you the world has no place for the hypersensitive. It has always been shaped, in ways both seen and unseen, by those who felt too much. Every bridge, every poem, every act of courage was born first in a mind that lingered on something others walked past. Sensitivity is the ability to notice what the hurried eye misses. The first leaf turning in autumn, the hesitation in a friend's voice, the moment a stranger's face changes because they feel understood. These small recognitions are not small at all. They are the threads that keep the fabric of the world from fraying. And yet, my dear poet, I will not lie to you. This way of living will tire you. There will be days when you wish you could feel less, want less, care less. On those days, simplify. Go back to the tree, the stone, the page. Let the world be just one thing at a time. Drink tea without reading. Walk without speaking. Watch the light shift across your room as though it were an entire play performed for you alone. You are not withdrawing from life when you do this. You are meeting it in its truest form. If you are to remember anything from our journey, let it be this. You do not live despite your hypersensitivity. You live through it. It is the lens through which you will see beauty more vividly, love more fully, and yes, suffer more deeply. But the suffering will teach you the exact weight of joy and how to hold it without breaking. In the quiet years of my life, illness slowed me. I could no longer roam as I once had. My companions became the seasons outside my window, the familiar spine of a book, the rustle of a letter being opened. And it was then I saw clearly. All along, I had been seeking not grand triumphs, but moments of unguarded presence. A smile that lingers, a sentence that feels like it has always been waiting for you, the scent of bread from a street you will never walk again. This is life, not the accumulation of days, but the distillation of them into something you can hold in your palm. If you wish to apply what you have heard tonight, begin with one act. Notice. Notice without the urgency to judge or fix. Notice the way light falls on the hand of someone you love. Notice the weight of the pen before you write. Notice your own breath and how it changes when you remember something beautiful. This noticing is not passive. It is the first act of creation. And so, my dear poet, I leave you with the same blessing I have carried for years. May you be strong enough to remain open, patient enough to remain curious, and brave enough to remain tender. The world does not need more armor. It needs more souls willing to walk without it. If your heart must ache, let it ache in the direction of beauty. If your eyes must weep, let them weep where the tears will water something. Close them now, if you wish. Imagine the old tree whose roots held my first words. Imagine the letter that travels from my desk to your nightstand without ever crossing a postman's hand. Imagine that somewhere, perhaps centuries from now, another hypersensitive soul will read these words and feel a little less alone. Perhaps that soul is you. Sleep now with your sensitivity beside you like a trusted friend. Tomorrow you will wake and carry it into the day, not as a burden, but as a light you alone know how to tend. And when you meet the dragons, you will remember. Perhaps they are only waiting for you to act, just once, with beauty and courage.